Welcome to this third episode of Norwich Theatre Talks. Later in this third edition, I'm going to be talking to Michael Williams, the artistic director of Buxton International Festival, and my co-conspirator and collaborator on the brand new musical production, A Land of Might Have Been, which comes to Norwich in July of this year. But first, we're recording this podcast at the end of the National Children's Mental Health and Wellbeing Week, and this gives us an incredible opportunity to platform and shine a spotlight on those challenges facing our children and young people today. And to do that, my first guest is someone who throughout a career in Parliament, as a government minister, and now after Parliament, has always championed these issues and driven for policy changes and reforms. Sir Norman Lamb. Welcome, Norman, to Norwich Theatre Talks. It's lovely to have you here.
Great pleasure.
During this Children's Mental Health and Wellbeing Week. And as I said in my introduction earlier on, during your time in Parliament, you had a range of different policy issues and ministerial responsibilities. But coming out of Parliament, you must have had some big decisions around where you wanted to give your time post-Parliament in this phase of your career. And it's clearly been focused on mental health. Tell us a bit about what you've been doing.
Yeah, I did decide as I left Parliament that I wanted to focus particularly on mental health. It had become an increasingly important part of the work I was doing in Parliament,
Yes.
particularly given the last ministerial job that I did in the Department of Health. And I'd sort of obviously grown reasonably knowledgeable about the issues, and I had some quite strong views about how the system that seeks to support people with mental ill health needs to change, because I think it fails so many people miserably. And we, of course, have had our own family experience of that, which has informed a lot of my thinking. So I was very determined to find a role that allowed me to try to have some impact, and in particular on that debate about how we need to change the system to, I guess in a sense, be more ambitious for people than our mental health system, I think, allows at the moment.
Yeah. And I mean, you began conversations and were brave enough to share your own family's experience of mental health, trauma and crisis much sooner than a lot of other people did. It feels like currency to talk about these kind of issues now, but we can't stop that, can we? Because the system needs to change, but there's still a way to go in terms of society's view on these issues.
There very much is, and I think I think we've made big advances over the last decade or so in opening up about mental health, but there are many parts of our communities where stigma is still very powerful, and I think if we're honest, we've opened up about anxiety and depression and the things that are in a way most common. Have we really cracked the stigma of more severe mental ill health, the psychosis, the schizophrenia and so forth? I think people who experience significant mental health issues still face enormous stigma and disadvantage in society that is not really justified. And so I think we're inevitably, as with every society, we're on a journey here, and you're absolutely right, we've got a long way still to go.
It strikes me that there's still that shift when somebody is suffering from or depression or anxiety. The word bout is often used, but that we need to get over this hump, don't we, of realising that living with a mental health condition, often very complex things like personality disorders, is no different to somebody living with chronic sciatica or a physical condition.
And often much more significant in terms of its impact on your happiness, your well-being, than physical health conditions may be.
But often there are systems and knowledge in place, aren't there, to adjust to people. So, I was reflecting in being an employer the other day that if somebody had a fall and was off work for a while and they came back and needed a new chair or a new computer or a new desk or something, we wouldn't think twice. But if somebody came into the workplace with a complex mental health condition, we challenge ourselves there as to whether talking therapy was something we should do to keep them in the workplace. Because there is that sort of the system point that you made. There is that legal underpinning, isn't there, around physical conditions, but there's more to go around mental health.
It's interesting, though, that I'm an ex-lawyer as well in my past life. The legal underpinning is actually there for mental health as well,
Right.
but it hasn't been sufficiently recognised and understood. And there's a brilliant guy who I've had a lot of contact with over the years who has been campaigning about the public duty to make reasonable adjustments for people who have disabilities. Critical point being that disability includes mental ill health. And what he has sort of uncovered is that public institutions, including organisations like Inland Revenue and Customs, and insurance companies, a whole range of organisations that have a massive impact on people's lives, particularly financial, simply fail to make adjustments for people who have mental ill health. And with big consequences for people's lives. And, you know, you think about someone who might have a mortgage, who might go through periods when, because of their health, are not meeting their mortgage obligations. Well, do you move straight to enforcement against them, or do you have some understanding that, you know, rescheduling the payments might be a way of sorting the problem out?
Absolutely.
So we need to open up that conversation, and we are not nearly sophisticated enough in recognising the importance of supporting people who have significant mental health problems, and also recognising that if you make adjustments, people who have mental health problems can offer so much to society. You know, they have so much to offer, which is so often denied to society because of the way we treat people.
And that brings us quite nicely to mental health within children and young people, doesn't it? Because this is where we start to move to system change, away from waiting for mental health issues and trauma to manifest itself in later life, but actually having a culture whereby we can spot, prevent, early diagnose and support. And you've championed that as a specific issue, haven't you?
Well, it's so good to hear you say that, because that's exactly how the current system works. It's passive. You wait for sort of demand to hit you. I remember when I first arrived at the South London and Maudsley, which I chair, I said to someone quite senior, we must start to focus on prevention, how we prevent mental ill health. And he said, we're not commissioned to do that. And it was sort of like, is that a good enough answer? And so I absolutely agree that the debate needs to shift on how we maintain well-being, how we prevent people's health deteriorating, recognising that there are social determinants of our mental health and our well-being, things like poor housing, poverty, and also that those adverse childhood experiences, as they're called, trauma, abuse, neglect, which has a significant impact on our mental health. There's a very strong, at least, correlation. We don't understand exactly how it works, but there's a strong correlation between experiencing trauma or abuse in early years and then the subsequent emergence of poor mental health, but also often poor physical health, poor educational attainment, and just tragically too often a drift towards the criminal justice system as well.
And this feels like the moment for this debate to be more live and pushed to the fore more than ever, doesn't it? I was really struck by a statistic from the Prince's Trust which said that 1 in 4 young people currently say they are finding it difficult to cope with life in the aftermath of COVID-19. So this is presenting itself, and that period of the pandemic has just brought trauma for all of us, but particularly young people who've missed key bits of early development to life.
Well, so we know there's been a very significant, sharp uptick in demand for mental health services in the aftermath of the pandemic. So it's borne out by the data. And if you think about it, there were so many risk factors at play during that pandemic. Isolation, loneliness, anxiety about the future, fear about employment consequences. A lot of families were living in considerable stress because of financial worries. Of course, now we've drifted into a cost of living crisis where many families are under massive pressure financially. And so the sort of stress in a household, which has a significant impact on children within that household, is probably higher than ever. So there's an awful lot going on in society.
Yeah.
I mean, in addition to these sort of the impact of the pandemic and the cost of living crisis, the war in Ukraine and so forth, that all comes on top of stresses of modern society, which we know is having an impact on young people's mental health, because the incidence of poor mental health amongst young people was already rising significantly before the pandemic.
I mean, we can't deny that this is system failure within our health services.
Totally.
And, you know, we can't deny that. And it's been extraordinary for me over the years to hear people say, I don't think they want to hear from me until I'm at that extreme point of crisis. And it's appalling. Do you know, we have to get there.
We often in the mental health world preach the principle of early intervention. You know? So it's a well-accepted principle that if you intervene early, you have a better chance of helping that person recover. And yet the system delivers the latest possible intervention. That's the great irony of it. And it's shocking, scandalous. I think our so-called CAM system, children and adolescent mental health system, is broken and dysfunctional. It fails families and young people routinely across the country. I mean, just imagine being a 14-year-old and being told you've got to wait a year before treatment starts. And it not only has an impact on your health could well deteriorate during that year while you're waiting, but of course it has a massive impact on your education as well. So, you know, this system is failing seriously. And interestingly, I mean, the UK is not alone. Countries across the Western world are experiencing significant increases in the incidence of mental ill health amongst children and young people. But other countries, take Australia, Canada, Sweden, by way of example, are busy reforming their system, how they respond to youth mental ill health in a rational way. And we're way behind the curve on this, and so I spend a lot of my time agitating for change and to put pressure on government and the NHS itself to recognise that we are failing families and that we need to change. We have a responsibility to change the system.
Absolutely, and I feel that agitation and that frustration, because we can feel powerless, and you know that system change that needs to happen sits there. And I suppose what I've reflected on leading a large arts organisation here in Norfolk, where by gosh these kind of issues are hugely prevalent, is how does the rest of society and different sectors get behind this? And we've thought long and hard, particularly during the pandemic, about the role of creativity within that, both as a coping mechanism and early intervention offer. And you know, during the pandemic, we did so much work online with older people feeling that sense of isolation. And now coming out of the pandemic and recognising the shifts in the education system, we are trying to find ways of making the case for creativity as a cost-effective way of providing that kind of early intervention and distraction and, you know, for me...
Purpose.
Absolutely. And, you know, whether that's in school settings, like an amazing project that we're really proud to be part of with the Wensum Trust, which is supporting creativity in their trauma and approach to trauma, or even something as simple as pantomime. I'm really touched every year when you see 4 generations of family enjoying panto together, and that sort of happiness output.
Yeah.
86% of audience say they just feel happier from
Yeah.
panto. What do you think the role of creativity can be, the appropriate role that creativity can be in influencing change?
Well, I completely embrace everything you've said, incidentally. And there's a really good book by a guy called Johann Hari called Lost Connections. And he talks about how in modern society we've lost our connection with one another very often. We can become very isolated, particularly in inner city urban areas. Lost connections with nature and lost connections with creativity. And he talks about how we need to rebuild these connections. And you're busy doing just that, and I think it's wonderful. And that the CAMS system sees treatment in a clinic as the answer to every mental health problem, and sometimes that is necessary. I don't want to downplay or disregard the importance and value of that, but so often we're talking actually about mental distress that's being caused by life experiences. And if we can give people purpose and happiness, happiness is a underrated value, it seems to me. I think governments should be focused on the happiness of our society. And you talk about a family, 4 generations enjoying a pantomime. What's better than that? So I think there's an enormous role for theatres, such as Theatre Royal, to go into schools, to work with schools, to provide opportunities for young people who may well have never had the chance of that sort of creativity. And it opens up a whole new world for them. Literature as well, of course, and the arts in the widest possible sense are of enormous value.
Absolutely. And in this Children's Mental Health and Wellbeing Week, if I was to put you on the spot, Norman, and to your everyday person that doesn't work in the NHS, isn't a policymaker, that wants to have an impact, because so often with these issues that there's no lack of respect or understanding for them, but people can feel powerless, can't they, to help. If you were to give 3 messages to everybody who can positively support this kind of agenda, what would they be?
Well, I guess the first message is to recognise that every family is touched by mental health issues in one way or another. We all have mental health, and it's a big spectrum. And so let's just open up about it and be honest and open and supportive of people. So that's, I think, the first message. The second is, in a sense, be optimistic and ambitious for people, because I think often when someone is told they have a diagnosis of some sort of mental health problem, they see it, and perhaps loved ones see it, as almost like a life sentence, that this person is bound to have a bad life, a difficult, challenging life. Well, actually, we all have challenging lives in one way or another, but you can so often get to a better place. Even if the symptoms don't disappear, you can get to a point where life can be fulfilling, where you can have good experiences. One of my great frustrations, our oldest son, Archie, diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder. And we went through all those emotions as a family. We went through years of emotional turmoil. He's now 35, birthday yesterday. A bit shocking to realise he's that
Happy
old.
Birthday, Archie.
But he still has anxiety, but he's thriving. And in the arts, incidentally, in the music business, and has done really well. But I suppose the brutal honesty of it is that when we were desperate and we were failed by the NHS, we paid for treatment because we could. But the injustice is that so many people simply have no option but to sit and wait, and that's the shocking aspect of it, and why I'm so driven to ensure that mental health is treated as equally important as any other sort of health. The third message, I guess, it's not to neglect and concerns that you might have, because someone who may be showing signs of distress or anxiety, it's easy to fear that you say the wrong thing. But by doing nothing, that person may well be feeling helpless. And sometimes awful things happen as a result of silence. And so don't fear mental health. Talk to a loved one and offer support and kindness and generosity of spirit. And I think in that way, we all benefit. And that person, it might be the life-changing thing that leads to improvement for that person.
That's a phenomenal message to end on, but the one of kindness and hearing and sharing in your feelings. And I think that's very much through the programme that we are developing across this year, either work on the stage or participatory activity that provides that safe space for those kind of conversations.
And if you're a teenager, and you're anxious about things going on in your head, you think you're the only one who's... I mean, I remember Archie saying, "Why am I the only person who's going mad?" And just imagine trying to cope with that as a teenager. It's very hurtful, distressing as a parent to hear that. Of course, the truth is that they're absolutely not the only one. This is life. And once that people can open up and realise that there are other people going through similar experiences, the burden that is lifted off people's shoulders is enormous.
And that's the power of stories, isn't it?
Totally.
And both to listen to other people's stories and over time be brave enough to share your story. And that's circled back to, as much as providing space for people, it's about what the arts can do to platform those things, because it is learning. And over time and by stealth, the more stories that we tell and the more diverse these stories around living with mental health conditions becomes, the more we're going to affect that kind of societal and hopefully system change.
Absolutely, yeah. And you've got such a valuable role to play, and it's brilliant. I really pay credit to you that you as an organisation are choosing to do this, because you can have such a positive impact on people's lives.
That's very much our hope. Norman, it's been brilliant to have you. Later in this podcast, we're hearing about a phenomenal story that we're telling later in the summer, which is our co-production with Buxton International Festival, a show called The Land of Might Have Been, which is based on the early life of Vera Brittain. And there are some amazing stories within that, actually, around what challenges young people felt in that society that actually has real resonance today. But the reason I wanted to mention this is very much a project of somebody that I think was very dear to your heart, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago, which was Shirley Williams, because of course Vera Brittain was her mother. And to provide my segue to my guest later,
very smart.
I thought it would be lovely, as somebody that was very close to Shirley, this is the first telling of her mother's story in this way. Just hear what you think she might have thought of that.
Well, I think she would have loved the fact that this is happening here, and her daughter worked, certainly may still be working in Norwich, so there are strong connections to this county. But Shirley was very important to me. When I had lost the second election I fought in North Norfolk, I very nearly gave up at that point, because it's draining emotionally on you. And I got a card from Shirley, and it said, "Dear Norman, it took me 3 attempts to get elected to Parliament. You've got to give it another go." And if you get that instruction from Shirley, you do what you're told. And throughout my sort of parliamentary career, she was extraordinarily supportive of me, supported me when I stood for the leadership. I went to Kashmir with her on the most amazing trip, and it was an honour to know her. There was one wonderful moment we were in a hotel in Jammu. It was a time of significant tension. There were bombs going off and so forth, and there were armoured vehicles outside. And there was an armed guard outside Shirley's bedroom, but not outside ours. So they clearly regarded her as so much more important, and rightly so.
They knew the preciousness. Oh, Norman, thank you for sharing your memories of Baroness Shirley Williams as well, and for joining us on Norwich Theatre Talks. Thank you.
Enormous pleasure.
Thank you.
Experience the music of Bob Dylan like never before in the acclaimed stage musical, Girl from the North Country. This Grammy-nominated and Olivier Award-winning show features classic Dylan hits, including Like a Rolling Stone, I Want You, Hurricane, and many more. Girl from the North Country now returns to the UK for its first major tour, coming to a venue near you in 2023. Don't miss Girl from the North Country, live on stage.
At the end of my chat with Sir Norman Lamb, we talked briefly about his great friend, mentor, and the iconic politician Baroness Shirley Williams. Later this year, it's the story of Shirley Williams' mother, the similarly iconic campaigner for equality's Vera Brittain, that we will be telling in a landmark new musical production with Buxton International Festival. I'm delighted now to welcome the writer of that story and artistic director of Buxton, Michael Williams, to chat to us about The Land of Might Have Been. Michael, it's lovely to welcome you to Norwich. This evening we're going to be sharing your production of Cinderella with audiences, but today I really wanted to talk about this really exciting collaboration we have coming up this summer, and to talk a bit about the different parts that make this really special. Now, I ended my last interview talking to Norman Lamb about the wonderful, the iconic Baroness Shirley Williams, and this is how you first came to this project and were introduced to the story of her mother, Vera Brittain. So I wondered, tell us a bit about it, because that's an amazing story.
Well, I got the job as CEO of the Buxton International Festival in 2018, and I was very quickly taken under the wing by Shirley Williams. And the office staff said to me, Michael, you've got to have coffee with this woman. She comes to the festival all the time. She sells out every time. She's really important. So I was like, okay, fine. So I went and had coffee with her. And she said to me, you must come down to the Houses of Parliament and I'll show you around. So a month later, she arranged it. I went down to London. We went and had fish and chips and mushy peas in the canteen overlooking the Thames. And I had a lovely conversation with Shirley. And all these very important people started showing up, like David Cameron and Lord so-and-so. And they were sort of paying court to Shirley. And I was like, well, clearly she's more important than I think that I knew she was. And then she said to me as we were ending our lunch, she said, you must do a musical piece on my mother. And I was like, oh dear.
Google.
Oh dear, her mother? She wants me to do something on her mother? I was like, oh, okay, fine. Of course, I didn't do anything about it. At the festival that July, she came up and she said, don't forget about my mother. Yes, Shirley, yes, sure. A year passed, didn't do anything. I'm way too busy. I'm not going to do a piece on Shirley Williams' mother. And a year later, I saw her again at the festival and she said, Michael, how's the piece coming on my mother? And I said, no, I'm sorry, I haven't got to it yet. And then it was in 2020, that interminable lockdown period, when I discovered that Ivor Novello's music, Stephen, was in the public domain in 2022. And I mentioned this to a conductor, Wyn Davies, Welsh conductor, and he said to me, oh, that's interesting. So we can now take his music. I said, yes, and I'm looking for a story on using the music of Ivor Novello. And his wife said, well, I have a perfect story for you. Have you read Testament of Youth? And I was like, Testament of Youth? Yes, by Vera Brittain. Well, okay, no. So she gave me the book. I went home, started reading it, realized this was the story, and then discovered that it was Shirley Williams' mother.
What a wonderful, wonderful coming together.
So, and then the other hugely important thing was that I discovered that Ivor Novello was born in 1893 in October, and Vera Brittain was born in 1893 in September. He was 20 years old when he wrote Keep the Home Fires Burning. Vera was 20 years old when she said goodbye to Roland on his way to the front.
Wow.
And when the board accepted the idea, I got hold of her, phoned her, left a message on her on the office in Parliament, wrote her an email. All day she didn't come back to me. I phoned her again just before I went home on a mobile. Got home to find out that she had died and passed away that morning.
Gosh.
And so she never knew.
So a set of amazing kind of happenstance, really. And I'm sure, and I asked Norman Land this earlier in this podcast, he thought she would be delighted to see this work come to life. But let's talk a little bit about Vera, because she is obviously central to the story, but it's focusing in on that early part of her life. This isn't biographical all the way through her life. It's a moment in time, isn't it? And particularly that looks at relationships.
That's true. And I think for all of us, we have moments that form our lives. We have moments that suddenly our lives all have a meaning because we understand what we're here to do. And really, that period from 1915 to 1917 was hugely formative for the young Vera Brittain. She went through the crucible of the First World War. She lost her dear brother, Edward. She lost her dear friend, and she also lost her fiancé, Roland. And this searing, tragic loss essentially put her on the road to becoming an activist, a feminist, and most of all, a pacifist. And it spurred her on into her writing career. The book of her life was Forever to Stop Another War Happening.
Yes.
And it's essentially, the musical is really about that moment where she's determined not to be the stay-at-home wife of the Edwardian society. She wants to carve out independence for herself, and then she falls in love with this gorgeous young man. And despite all of her intentions, she struggles with this thing of understanding what it means to be in love. And then he passes away and dies tragically. And this shapes her destiny in many ways.
But these are stories that feel universal, but set in different times. And in a way, what I've found fascinating about this is to ask the question when hearing these stories, is if they were taking place now, how different would those lives have been? And of course, the other relationship in this story is that of Vera's brother and the young man that he falls in love with, that is a completely hopeless love affair, but they try, don't they? And it's just incredible in that context of war and those questions around our human rights and society to reflect on those things now, because in one way we've come so far, but in others, when we look at things happening perhaps in Eastern Europe, we also haven't, have we?
No. So it is important that the story revolves around these four young people living through the best summer of their lives.
Yeah.
And what is fascinating is that Edward's story is brought to life in a very different way than perhaps people will realize. Young Edward was a composer, violinist. They loved one another very dearly, the two of them, and what nobody knew was that Edward was gay. And he was really in love with a school friend. And what happened to Edward was that he managed to survive the Battle of Somme, won a medal for his bravery. But then on the Italian and Austrian front, his commanding officer called him and said, "Captain Edward Brittain, don't you realize your letters are censored by the base? There is a call for a court-martial for you for the fact that you are, in fact, having a homosexual relationship with a young officer. And you will be put before the court-martial, possible death sentence, possible imprisonment, certain public disgrace." And rather than face that humiliation, the young Edward, the following day, threw himself into harm's way and was killed. Vera only found this out 20 years later when the commanding officer called her to his deathbed and revealed this to her. Did she know that her brother was gay? I suspect she did. What were the social mores of the time? that didn't allow him to be who
No, that's right.
he was.
And
So that's the second love
it's-
story, Stephen.
And it's incredible, isn't it? I always go back to context, because I think in a Western world we can listen to these stories and think they are something of history, because we take so much now for granted in terms of society. But we'd be lying to ourselves if we didn't think people are living those lives elsewhere in the world, and those issues aren't on our doorstep anymore, but are very much part of accepted society elsewhere. And I think that sort of links to Novello, really, doesn't it? Because one of the things that really captured my imagination is I am a huge Novello fan. I've always adored the songs. There's something so lyrical to them that they're the consummate earworm, aren't they? You can hear a Novello melody and then it's just suddenly kind of stuck there. And I think lots of us might have heard these tunes and never known it was him. But he's a composer I've always thought that never really got his moment in the sun, and quite a hidden personality, of course, because it's now fully accepted that Novello was gay as well.
Fascinating that Novello was more popular than Andrew Lloyd Webber in his day.
Yes.
The musicals that he put on the West End were completely sellout. In terms of comparisons, we should probably look at the early American composers, Rodgers and Hammerstein,
Yeah.
Kern, for example. That would be comparisons to the sort of music that Ivor Novello was writing. But he was also the link with Edwardian operetta and then moving into musical. So fascinating. But what was really interesting for me was that his longtime lover, husband of the time, I suppose, Bobby was his name, he was writing songs to Bobby. So
Yes.
the wonderful tune, My Dearest Dear,
Yes.
which is features in the piece where young Edward looks at his Bobby and says to him, my dearest dear, trust me. This is a quintessential romantic song for heterosexual couples, and yet Ivor was writing this for Bobby.
Absolutely.
So when you have a man singing it to a man, suddenly the song takes on such poignancy in its delivery, and
Absolutely.
that's the story we're telling. These two young men working out how to have a relationship in a society that
Yeah.
wasn't allowing them to do that.
And the musical score to this is utterly glorious.
Ravishing.
And for anybody that might not have dipped into Novello, I'd recommend, if you've never seen Gosford Park, actually it's a brilliant way to hear those songs, because he is a character in that film and the music runs throughout it. And a lot of those tunes actually you'll find in Land of Might Have Been. But Novello, during his life, he wrote works for the stage, and he full-length works for the
That's
stage.
right.
But for one reason or another, they've not survived to this day. So for this project, we've brought in a different lyricist and writer. And of course, you've written the narrative and the book that weaves all of this story and this amazing music together.
And what's been fascinating about it is working with Ian Farrington, who is the arranger and composer. We've created 2 pieces, original pieces for the piece, but the rest are all Novello's music.
Yeah.
And what Ian has done is that he has reframed much of the score so that for a modern audience, they will just feel its energy and vitality, and at the heart of it are his glorious tunes.
Yes.
So, for example, we take 2 of the songs and we call it a mashup, and we put the 2 songs together to create a modern quartet.
Yeah.
We have a number which is the boys' trio, and suddenly we make it into this very tight harmonic structure. We use a lot of music of Ivor Novello that audiences won't know, but we'll be bringing back into the fold. And then, of course, there are some of the songs which I didn't need to change one single word of the lyric because they fitted in perfectly to the story. My Dearest Dear being one, Glamorous Night being another, and of course the famous one, We'll Gather Lilacs. Not a word is moved from that at all.
Absolutely. As if it was always meant to be.
Exactly.
Now, one of the things that has always frustrated me, and you and I have talked about this, is how we allow these amazing stories, however they're created, to be defined by tags we put on them. Is it a musical? Is it an opera? Is it a drama? And within this, you and I have talked about it. It is a story told beautifully to beautiful music. What would you say to those that might think, oh, I only see opera, or I don't like opera, I go to musicals?
Yeah, this is certainly not an opera in an operatic style. However, it does require some classical singing.
Yeah.
This is absolutely a musical. Stephen, it's been a real challenge casting this. We've just finished the casting. And to find that artist that can both sing and act has been wonderful, because both are important in this piece.
Yeah.
We want to have our audience just come out and going, oh, the singing was beautiful, and also believing in the performance. So it's very much a book musical.
Yes.
With songs and dialogue, but the music is classically orientated. So for an opera fan, you're going to come and see an operetta. For a musical fan, you're going to come and see a really fine, wonderful music. And I also have to thank you, Stephen, because as part of the partnership, we came up with lots of titles for this piece. We had My Dearest Dear, we had Vera, we had April in Your Eyes, and Stephen, being the kind of person that he is, said to me, Michael, this is a really bad title you've got here. And I was like, this is great. My first relationship, my first meeting with you, Stephen says to me, we don't like the title, but I have an idea. What about The Land of Might Have Been? And you sold it to us, and we just all said, wonderful. So thank you, Stephen, for giving the title to this piece.
Well, we'll see if people buy into it or not. But, I guess, just to find my own cheekiness, I felt so strongly about this project, and that there's a story to tell there, and amazing music to be heard. And, to our audiences who might look at things and decide musical or opera, I would ask you really to put all of that aside. And a couple of years ago, we did a trial around audiences attending Miss Saigon, encouraging them to come to Madame Butterfly. And it worked, because we often get too defined by this. This is going to be a full-scale production with a 16-piece orchestra.
Correct.
In the pit.
16-piece cast, there's 16 cast
Absolutely,
members.
and amazing performance and production that goes with it. It opens in Buxton on the 17th of July?
It opens in Buxton at the opening. It's our opening performance on the 7th of July. We do 6 performances in Buxton.
That's right.
And then we transfer directly after Buxton to the Norwich Theatre, and we have 7 performances.
Absolutely.
In Norwich, and it's going to be very exciting.
Absolutely, and it opens at Norwich Theatre Royal on Tuesday the 25th of July. Book your tickets now, but what's really exciting is we're just setting about this journey, aren't we? We're sharing some of the songs, the casting is almost complete. So keep watching on stuff that goes out through Buxton social media channels, through Norwich Theatre's channels as well, because we really want to share this. This has been an amazing process, but it's an amazing process held by about a dozen people. And it's going to be really exciting to share how this show comes to life as well. Michael, thank you very much for joining us. It's lovely to have you in Norwich and to start this brilliant partnership with Buxton.
Thank you, Stephen.
That brings us to the end of this 3rd episode of Norwich Theatre Talks, which comes to you live from Norwich Theatre Playhouse, complete with all the background sounds like people rehearsing, people drinking in the bar, and we've even had the occasional bin lorry outside the window. That's live podcasting for you. It's been wonderful to talk to you again and to welcome brilliant guests, Sir Norman Lamb and Michael Williams. We love making these podcasts for you, so please keep your feedback coming, and we'll keep bringing the stories you want to hear and discussing the issues you'd like to discuss. Our 4th episode is coming soon, so keep an eye out for that. And in the meantime, book your tickets for A Land of Might Have Been, that's at Norwich Theatre Royal from the 25th to the 30th of July. See you next time.